Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third journal club of ISAR, IFS, and ACE with Cooper Surgical as the knowledge partner. This journal club, which is basically on the cleavage anomalies, multinucleation, or specific cell cycle kinetics that are observed in time-lapse imaging, are they predictive of any embryo development capacity or ploidy, is going to be conducted by Dr. Priya Kannan and moderated by Dr. Rajvi Mehta, who has more than 30 years of experience in IVF and is an academic consultant with Cooper Surgical. While Dr. Rajvi Mehta will be moderating and taking the questions towards the end with Dr. Priya, I would now request Dr. Rajvi to please introduce Dr. Priya Kannan and initiate the webinar.
Good evening, everybody. And at the outset, I would really like to thank Cooper Surgicals for taking this initiative of the Journal Club. In the times of this lockdown, it's always nice to have a good academic discussion with experts in the field. And I thank Dr. Priya Kannan. Dr. Priya doesn't really need a lot of introduction for anybody in the field of embryology. They do know her. But for the new people, she is a power pack who is a clinician and an embryologist packed into one. After doing her MBBS in India, she went to Australia and she has a double master's in reproductive medicine and clinical embryology. And she has been a leading light in our Academy of Clinical Embryologists, also an active participant in IFS and ACE. And today she will be talking to us about the paper by the group by Neena Desai, where they're going to talk about whether time-lapse imaging and the morphokinetic and morphology data that we achieve from time-lapse imaging helps us in predicting the developmental capacity of the embryo, and also whether if it can tell us about the ploidy status, because if time-lapse can do that, then we are safe from any other future invasive techniques. So without wasting much time, I hand over to Dr. Priya. Dr. Priya, please take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajvi, for the kind introduction, and I thank all the three societies, IFS, ACE, and ISAR for giving me this opportunity, and for Cooper Surgicals for being the academic partner on this. So I thought I would talk about or present to you this particular publication from Neena Desai and her group, or cleavage anomalies, multinucleation, or specific cell cycle kinetics observed with the time-lapse imaging, predictive of embryo developmental capacity or ploidy. So I thought it's a very interesting thing where they had the objective of both having the TL image morphokinetic data from the time-lapse imaging compared to the having some data from the PGS anomalies, and also with the cleavage anomalies, including multinucleation, to know whether A, they could be predictive of blastocyst formation, and B, predictive of the embryo chromosomal status. It was basically a retrospective analysis of prospectively collected morphokinetic and PGS results. They had included about 130 consecutive patients who underwent ICSI at Cleveland Clinic between April 12 to June 2016. They did not have an exclusion criteria of any minimum number of embryos that may be necessary to proceed with the PGS, and the study was approved by their IRB. In regard to ovarian stimulation, they had all combinations, agonist, antag. They use recombinant FSH with or without urinary. Trigger could be just HCG or HCG plus agonist. And on the embryo culture side, they had used two types of media, Life Global and GTL. So all these things we need to keep because they will be analyzing using these things as well. In regard to time-lapse analysis and embryo grading, they had all embryos were assessed daily by viewing the time-lapse video footage. The cleavage stage embryos were assessed for cell stage, percentage of fragmentation, multinucleation, and blastomere symmetry. Increase in cell-to-cell adherence between blastomeres resulting in the merging of cells or compaction was also monitored. Embryos at the 2 to 5 cell stage were carefully examined at several focal planes for multinucleation or the appearance of multiple nuclei within individual blastomeres. Anomalous cleavage behaviors were also tracked. apart from multinucleation such as reverse cleavage, direct uneven cleavage, and irregular chaotic division. Just a reminder about the cleavage behaviors. The reverse cleavage embryos were the one which had completed a karyokinesis and blastomere separation, but subsequently had a refusion of two blastomeres. In direct uneven cleavage embryos, a single blastomere divided directly from 1 to 3 cells. This can occur at first, second, or third cleavage divisions. Irregular chaotic embryos, characteristically, they struggle to divide into cleanly separate embryos. Typically, the division involves much twisting, irregularity, blebbing and ruffling of Ullema membrane, and formation of pseudofurrows with no cell division. And such embryos can result with an embryo with irregular blastomeres with large cellular fragments. In regard to blastocysts, they were assessed as 114 and 138 hours. Blastocysts were evaluated for expansion, inner cell mass development, trophectoderm appearance using the Eschrey grading system. Their inter-observer variation was controlled through peer review and regular review of grading at monthly lab meetings. In regard to the cell kinetics, they had observed the timing of all the cell divisions from 2 cell, 3, 4, 5, 8, 9, compaction, the start of the morula, start of blastulation, start to becoming a full blastocyst and expanded blastocyst, starting with the start of ICSI as being the T0. Duration of the cell cycle interval were also noted. CC2, S2, CC3, S3, and expansion with the expansion from the expanded blastocyst from the start of blastulation was also determined. The annotation for precise time of blastose expansion, that is blastose formation and expansion, were standardized among the embryologists. The moment there is an appearance of a cavity with 3 to 4 flattened trophectodermal cells marked the start of a blastocyst. Increase in embryo diameter with thinning of the zona was noted as a blastocyst expansion. Herniation of 3 to 4 trophectodermal cells through the zona opening, which was created on day 3, was a timing of expansion and hatching. The blastocysts cryopreserved individually using rapid eye carrier, and the ETs were performed either fresh or vitrified following the PGS cycle. 1 or 2 euploid, 1 maybe even 2 euploid blastocysts were selected for transfer, which was based on the history of the patient. Methodology which they had done for the PGS, they had LH done on day 3. And the trophectoderm biopsy was performed on expanded blastocyst using biopsy pipette to remove at least 5 to 8 cells. They had used initially CGH and then followed by NGS. For NGS, the samples that did not exhibit a gain or loss that was clearly distinguishable baseline loss was diagnosed as normal. Samples containing up to 20 to 30% mosaicism were also classified as normal. However, the concordance between both these testing methods have been reported by the testing laboratory during the validation studies. In regard to the most important thing, which is the data collection and the statistical analysis, they had used a variety as required by the data. The continuous data as expressed were means with standard deviation and categorical data as percentages. Univariate analysis using the student's t-test was used for comparison of the timing, chi-square to identify variables affecting blastocyst development and euploidy. Logistic regression analysis was used to adjust for the female age, that is the maternal age, and to examine the relationship between that and orbital status. Multivariate logistic regression analysis was used to create a model for enhanced selection of euploid embryos. Analysis of receiver operating characteristics and determination of the area under the curve were used to analyze the predictive ability of the selection model for euploidy. Odds ratio and the confidence interval were also calculated. The statistical analysis was performed using the JMP, and P less than 0.05 was considered statistically significant. Now coming to the results, which is quite interesting. They had about 130 patients going in for PGS, and in total they had about 160 cycles. No data were collected on patients who planned PGS but had inadequate blastocyst development. The three primary diagnoses for whom PGS screening were done was A, advanced maternal age, male factor, and unexplained infertility. Mean patient age was 36.3 plus or minus 4.3. The same group had another publication a few years ago in which the exclusion criteria was less than 38 years. So I guess there's difference between each study. In total, there were about 1,478 zygotes which were cultured in embryoscope. A total of 836 blastocysts were biopsied. PGS results were obtained for 767 of these blastocysts. 69 biopsied blastocysts, which is about 8.3%, had no diagnosis either due to sample insufficiency or non-amplification. Biopsy was not performed on 9% of the expanded blastocysts with distinctly compromised morphology and presence of degenerative cells. The chromosome status was diagnosed to be euploid in 41.6% of the tested embryos, which was 319. And in patients above 38 years and older, it was the results showed only 31% of the tested embryos were diagnosed as euploid, whereas in younger age group, which is less than 38 years, up to even 50% of the blastocysts were euploid. In 24.3% of the PGS, none of the tested blastocysts were diagnosed as euploid. Sibling embryos were cultured in the live global versus the GTL medium in the same alternate wells of the same slide and had the similar euploidy rates of 47 and 42% respectively. That is just a result of their implantation and pregnancy rates as compared to fresh, frozen, and more than 38 years and less than 38 years. In the implantation rate in the fresh was about 53%, and pregnancy rate was 45%. In frozen, it was about 62%, and the pregnancy rate was 49%. In the age group more than 38, the implantation rate was somewhere around 52 and 56%. In the age group less than, sorry, I put it more in the other way. In more than 38 was a 47 and 53%. Coming to the analysis of the results that they had retrieved with the analysis of so much of data, the overall incidence of multinucleation, reverse cleavage, DUC and ICT among the 1,478 cultured embryos was 35.7, 10, 8 and 15.6 respectively. In 14% of the embryos, 2 or more dysmorphisms were observed. Developmental pattern of embryos with a single or multiple dysmorphisms were contrasted to a subset of embryos which exhibited no cleavage dysmorphism. That is the total table they had given, but I just broke it down so that we can easily analyze. In regards to multinucleation, the multinucleated embryos behaved similar to the embryos exhibiting no dysmorphism, with 79.6% of the embryos which had multinucleation initiated blastulation and 65.2% progressing to established expanded blastocyst. So if we could see here, with none it was 68.4%. With multinucleation, it was 65.2%, and it was not statistically significant. Another important point was the multinucleation did not appear to be associated with increased rate of aneuploidy. With embryos with no dysmorphism, 43% of the embryos were euploid, and in multinucleation, it was 42.3%. And it was not statistically significant. In terms of reverse cleavage, the results of this study showed that reverse cleavage also did not affect embryo advancement. 73% of the embryos went in to initiate blastulation, and 57.7% formed expanded blastocyst. And reverse cleavage did not appear to be associated with an increased rate of aneuploidy as well. In embryos which had no dysmorphism, 77.7% started blastulation, and 68% went to become expanded blastocyst. Whereas with the embryos that exhibited reverse cleavage, 73% went into start blastulate, and 57.7% became expanded blastocyst, and it was not statistically significant. The same with euploidy as well. 43% of the embryos which did not have any dysmorphism were euploid, whereas 52.6% with reverse cleavage did have were found to be euploid, and both the difference was not statistically significant. In terms of direct uneven cleavage embryos were observed to be significantly impaired, with only at least 50% of them starting blastulation and only 34% forming expanded blastocysts. However, this also did not appear to be associated with increased rates of aneuploidy. In regards to irregular chaotic divisions, embryos exhibited impacted early capacity for blastocyst initiation as well as expansion. Only 63% went on to have initiate blastulation, and 52.6% progressed to become expanded blastocyst. And this was statistically significant. However, this also did not appear to be associated with increased rate of aneuploidy. It was quite interesting to note that all of these cleavage anomalies or dysmorphism did not appear to be associated with the increased rate of aneuploidy. However, when the embryos had exhibited more than one dysmorphism, then the blastocyst formation was significantly impaired than compared to when the embryo exhibited a single dysmorphism. It was statistically significant. And there was also an increased likelihood of the embryo which had exhibited more than one dysmorphism to be an aneuploid. Among this subset, 66% of the embryos which had more than one dysmorphism had multinucleation along with other dysmorphisms such as reverse cleavage, direct uneven cleavage, or ICD. Now moving on to the early cell division kinetics. The optimal range used for early cell kinetic marker was T3 minus T2 was more than 5, the same as has been already published. And by the results of the study, they had shown that, as we have already seen in many other studies before, that early cell kinetics were highly predictive for the blastocyst formation and expansion. However, they were not predictive of the euploidy of the embryos, which is clear from this table that they had given. So when the T3 minus T2, that is CC2, was within the range, 81% of the embryos started becoming a blastocyst, and 70% of them became an expanded blastocyst. Whereas when it was out of sync, then only 50% started blastulation, and only 36.5% of those embryos went to become an expanded blastocyst. But even then, the other things as well, none of these in or out of these early cell kinetics had any significant difference in the euploidy status of the embryos. In regard to late cell division kinetics, correlation of the late kinetic parameters to euploidy rates in blastocysts, it was found. The mean time from ICSI to the start of blastocyst formation was significantly longer in the aneuploid embryos, and the mean was 100.6 hours as compared to 98.7 hours in euploid embryos. Progression to expanded blastocyst was also significantly delayed in aneuploid embryos, which was a mean of 113.9 versus an euploid embryo, which had a mean of 110.3 hours. As seen in this table that was presented by the study, initiation of the blastocyst at less than 96.2 hours was significantly influenced the correlation between the expansion, the start of blastulation, and the euploid state of the embryo. The same with the expanded blastocyst, and the same were in the difference between the time difference between the start of the blastocyst to when it became an expanded blastocyst. So all these three parameters were found to be correlating to the euploidy status of the blastocyst. And that's a whole table that I had presented. So in that, again, we see that it's here that we see that they are statistically significant. The rest does not seem to be statistically significant as per this study. In terms of maternal age was an independent and a strong predictor of euploidy in this study as well. And what the authors wanted to do was to see whether the results might change if we had if the maternal age was taken out, whether the results they had given that the start of blastulation has to be 96.2 and other things still held the ground when the maternal age was taken out. And hence, they used logistic regression analysis of the selected parameters and adjusted for female age and their relationship to the euploidy. However, even when adjusted for maternal age, all those that were already inferred from the study still held ground. So even after adjusting for maternal age, embryo, whichever had displayed more than one dysmorphism, did have a poor chance of becoming a blastocyst. When the start of the blastulation was more than 96.2 hours, they did have a high chance of being an aneuploid. And when the expanded blastocyst did not happen at around 116 hours, those embryo also had a higher chance of being an aneuploid. When the difference between the start of the blastulation and expansion was more than 13 hours, those embryos also had a higher chance of being an aneuploid. However, the culture medium that they had used two culture medium, initially Life Global followed by GTL, did not seem to have a major difference. And embryo dysmorphism less than 2 and the ROC analysis performed to determine the predictive ability of this model for euploidy, the area under the curve turned out to be 0.66, which is a moderate predictability. So in terms of multinucleation, we know that, or we have been tuned to that multinucleated embryos are to be deselected, and based on this study, it can be inferred that multinucleation alone may not be linked to an abnormal chromosome complement, probably because of localization of multinucleated cell within the inner cell mass or the trophectodermal complements and their continued replication. Or there is a possibility of the embryo self-correction by exclusion of these cells during compaction or during blastulation. However, every study has got its own. In this, the retrospective analysis is the first thing that comes to our mind, and there was a transition in the methodology for chromosome testing used by the genetic testing laboratory from CGH to NGS technique during the study period had happened. Another one that can be slightly different, but I think something which we can talk about is, we do know that in some patients the dysmorphism will be more, which is a cluster, and in some it may not be. So, but here they have taken each embryo on an individual basis, probably they can go ahead and see if there are patients which exhibited a cluster of dysmorphisms, which could have ended up in those 25% of those patient embryos, or the group of embryos which never had any euploidy in that cohort as well. So that is another thing that I would like more, that info from this set of data as well. So in this, the four things that I do infer from this is early cell kinetics is predictive of the embryo developmental capacity to blastocyst, but do not correlate to embryoploidy. Late kinetic parameters, such as the start of blastulation, the time to which it takes the expanded blastocyst, the time interval appear to be associated with the likelihood of euploidy even after adjustment for maternal age. Embryo cleavage anomalies such as multinucleation alone may not be linked to blastocyst aneuploidy, and hence deselecting for embryos with 2 or more dysmorphisms significantly increases the odds of an euploidy and the potentially successful implantation. I guess the need of the hour, which we know is probably another thing, is although there seems to be a relationship between the ploidy status and the blastocyst morphology and developmental dynamics, prospective validation studies with day 5, day 6 blastocysts selected for transfer based on kinetic endpoints can lead to an universally applicable algorithms to enhance the selection of most competent early embryos or blastocysts for transfer. However, I did go through some other publications I thought which we can talk here, but another thing that we have to understand is it's been an ongoing thing since 2014, and we are at a cross times, like where we are thinking of whether we can apply. We are in a stage where we are learning so much more about the cell kinetics that each paper is throwing more information at us. So I guess we just have to wait for a longer, for a larger study, which is designed such that it more not lab-centric, but multi-centric studies should be done to give us more data on this. Go along with this publication, Basile and their colleagues in 2014 observed a difference in growth kinetics between chromosomally normal and abnormal. They identified T5 minus T2 and C normality, which was not the case here in this study. I'm just presenting papers which would have a difference. Chawla et al. Also observed that the addition of CC3 and T5 minus T2 and early kinetic timings significantly differed between a normal and an abnormal embryo, which was not the case in this particular study. But the one critical point was, in these two studies, the biopsy was taken in a cleavage stage embryo, whereas in the study by Nina Desai, they had done only trophoblast biopsy. Campbell and colleagues were one of the first and had proposed a risk classification system for the prediction of aneuploidy based on the timing for start of blastulation and blastocyst formation. That was also retrospective analysis of non-PGS data set using the risk classification system showed significantly higher clinical pregnancy and live birth rate with embryos classified at low risk with the time of start of blastulation 96.2, which is the same in this particular study as well. And the blastulation time to 122.9, however, it was 116 in the study, versus the mild difference. And in this study, they also emphasized on the study by Campbell on the start of compaction as another important kinetic marker. Kramer and colleagues and Rinzi et al. Also had studied similar, but both the studies were unable to successfully apply the same risk classification or examine or correlate morphokinetic characteristics to discriminate between euploid and aneuploid embryos. That is another study by Ninasi, on which the present study had taken some of their variables as well to 96 and 118. Here also, this study also said that the early kinetics did not seem to show any correlation to the euploidy of the ploidy of the embryos, whereas it was well correlated to the timing of the blastulation, to the initiation of blastulation, to expansion of the blastocyst, and the time interval, which did correlate to the ploidy of the embryos. So there are some studies which show this way and some which shows that way. I was just thinking as such in for labs which doesn't have a time lapse system, or they don't use PGS as normally as rampantly as the labs in USA do, probably we could infer from the time of blastocyst initiation to the expansion, we probably can infer some and do morphologic analysis of the embryos and then try to help our patients in that thing as well. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and we'll be happy to take some questions as well. Over to you, Rajvi.
Thank you, Priya, for this very lucid summarization of Dr. Neena Desai's paper. There are two questions already there. The first question is, can you hear me? Yeah. The first question is, what is your take on transferring blastocysts with PGS result showing mosaic aneuploid? No mosaicism.
Only mosaicism, or like, you know, but I guess in this study they had given 20 to 30% as their mosaicism. They had kept as normal. I guess we do have to, I think it is a call that we have to take with place of whether other normal embryos being there, we might have to choose them and keep this a last option. But otherwise, if this is the only option left, there has been some where we have to rely on the self-corrective mechanisms of the embryo and go ahead and transfer after counseling the patient, of course.
True. And in this particular question, they're talking of low mosaic embryos. So I think we would be as a second choice, or when we don't have choice, we could go ahead with it.
Yes, that's right.
You know, you have been emphasizing right through the paper that early morphokinetics does correlate with the formation of blastocysts, but not with ploidy. Just a question.
That's what the whole paper says.
Yes. So is it that those embryos which are slow growing or going beyond the proposed time limit are the ones which actually don't go towards blastocysts? So in that way, we are selecting, by culturing to blastocysts, we are selecting normal ploidy embryos, euploid embryos.
And that could be inferred from this study, yes. Okay. So if you're culturing to day 5, and then, but even if you're culturing to day 5, but then what the study by what Neena has said is, even if they become blastocysts, but if the start of the blastocyst is beyond 96 hours, or 96.7, which can be said as 97 hours, and they become expanded blastocysts way beyond 116 hours, still they have a high chance of becoming aneuploid.
Okay.
Yeah. Even if they start becoming the blastulation they become a blastocyst, but it has to happen by 96.2 hours. And if the expanded blastocyst is beyond 116 hours, they have a higher chance of becoming an aneuploid, which is almost twice than the one which sticks to the time limit. So not all blastocysts are probably have a high chance of being aneuploid.
Yeah. So there's a question from Dr. Sanjay. Could the reduced blastocyst formation in DUC mean that those that fail to form blasts might be aneuploid? So I think that's exactly what we were just discussing. So what would you like to tell him?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Could the reduced blastocyst formation in DUC mean that those that fail to form blast might be aneuploid? Did you get the question?
Hello?
Yeah, did you get the question? Hello,
Rajvi, I couldn't. No, I couldn't hear you in the middle. I can hear you now.
Okay, the question is, could the reduced blastocyst formation in DUC mean that those that fail to form blastocysts might be aneuploid?
Maybe, but also such that all that becomes blastocyst is not euploid.
So possibly what he's trying to communicate is that the difference between the cleavage stage embryos to blastocysts, the numbers that don't become blastocysts are likely to be aneuploid, and this is natural selection.
Probably, but not all blast are euploid. That's another thing that we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, so it's not that all blastocysts are healthy, are euploid, but it's so when they don't grow, yes, they could be aneuploid. Another question,
yes, that's right.
Whether the multinucleated embryos were categorized as the presence of multinucleated isolated blastomeres, or in more than one blastomere, or in all the cells. So I think when we can...
yeah, I'm seeing the question, whether the multinucleated embryos are categorized
as the presence of...
or in more than one blastomere or in all cells. The paper does not give that information.
Yeah. Okay, then the question is, would you like to transfer a multinucleated?
Probably they just looked at the blastolayer multinucleation, and that's about it.
Yeah. And the person is asking, can you still transfer a multinucleated blastocyst? Well, just a correction, we don't know whether there's multinucleation in the blastocyst in the cleavage stage. Yeah, Priya. Yeah, Priya, go ahead.
I mean, multinucleation blastocyst does not, we can't see. Yeah, multinucleation in the blastocyst we don't see, but however, if you see in the cleavage stage embryos, yes, I guess what they have, I mean, by this study, the multinucleation is not a single factor which determines or increases the chance of euploidy or aneuploidy in the embryos. So it had the same amount of like, you know, the euploidy as that of embryos that did not have any anomalies of cleavage anomalies as well, which is, we know, that is just going ahead our conventional ideas that we've always had, right?
And what I would like to clarify here is that the cleavage stage embryo was multinucleated, but then possibly it's getting corrected in the process by the time it became blastocyst. So the blastomeres are not essentially, we don't know whether they were multinucleated. There is no way to know that. So, okay, this question is, Madam.
That was the explanation they have also given that it could be that discard those cells which had multinucleation.
Right. Okay, so the next question is, Madam, is cleavage stage embryos are more likely to be euploid than blastocyst? You want to answer that? I think you covered that in the talk, but...
Sorry, can you come again? I'm not able to see that question here.
Our cleavage stage embryos are more likely to be euploid than blastocyst?
Cleavage stage embryos, it is not that we know that the embryonic genome gets activated on day 3, which is when become 8 cells, and after that, if they go ahead to form a blastocyst, that means there are higher chance of development. A. Number B is more chance of being in euploid. So I guess we have to, the very thing that an embryo develops to a blastocyst is a more chance of it being a euploid than of it being in the cleavage stage.
Okay, the next question is possibly the effect of biopsy. So has the study compared pregnancy rates between biopsied embryos versus those selected only by time lapse?
All the embryos that were presented in the study had TL and had underwent PGS. So every embryo had a PGS done on this in this study. Apart from that very small set of embryos which could not be biopsied. The rest of them were biopsied. All of them, see, all of them, 836 embryos were biopsied. They could not do some because, like, you know, they did not have some sufficient amount of blastocysts for biopsy, or some were atretic and stuff. But the rest of all the results they had presented is based on the embryos which had both TL and PGS done on them. It was not either, it's both.
Priya, would you like to comment on any other studies that you are aware of where they're comparing biopsied embryos, whether biopsy technique itself has any problem in the implantation or pregnancy rates?
Yeah, here. I had actually looked into it, and they had here. Rinsey actually had one, and she had about 455 biopsied blastocysts and morphokinetic, and was not able to show any discrimination or correlation between the morphokinetics and biopsied or euploidy of the embryos. So there are studies this way and that way as well. So
I guess it depends on the skill of the embryologist when it comes to biopsy. Okay, one more thing. Just time.
All these labs were like lab centric. So I guess it is like each lab has got its own probables and differences, and each lab is different. So all these were one lab. So I guess if we have more labs together in different conditions contributing to the same endpoints or the critical points and doing the PGS, then I guess we could have a varied set of results. All these are single lab, or I mean like at least a single group doing it. So I guess we might have to have, because each group doing it and each group goes ahead and says the same thing over and over again.
Yeah. Okay. The question is, has the data on time-lapse imaging give you some proof of embryo self-correction? So for example, if the early kinetics data is not good, is poor, and later it sort of, the late kinetics is improved. So do you see anything of that, of self-correction in terms of data from this study?
I think just the point that dysmorphisms which seen, the single ones which were seen earlier, went ahead to have the same amount of euploidy as embryos which did not exhibit any dysmorphism itself is one very good implication to show that embryo does have some self-corrective mechanisms. Otherwise, what we term as like, you know, the wrong cleavage pattern, or maybe I mean, that's our assumption. So what we do, and then, but they go ahead and show the same euploidy as embryos which does not have any dysmorphism. That itself is a corrective evidence of corrective mechanisms in the embryo. I think nature has got its way.
Embryo is much smarter than what we presume it to be.
Sorry?
I think the embryo is much smarter than what we presume it to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is a matter of time when we get to have more data and more information. We are just starting to take baby steps in that direction, I guess.
Okay, there's a question on combining conventional morphology assessment like 2PN, blastomere size, symmetry, fragmentation, etc., along with morphokinetics versus PGS for policy status. Would you like to comment on?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Your take on combining conventional morphology assessment. Somebody's moving. Along with like the usual 2PN, blastomere size, symmetry, fragmentation, etc., along with morphokinetics versus PGS for policy status. So I presume that comes from the proposed bill.
I guess we will continue to do the conventional morphology. That is our routine thing. But if we get more data which says that the time-lapse imaging at certain critical points, if you have noted these things, then it is a much better predictor of a developmental capacity of the embryo or the euploidy. I'm sure as a non-invasive procedure that would get more acceptance than PGS. But however, as of now, PGS biopsy seems to be the only way to have the result, like the more accurate result on the ploidy of the embryos. But as an inference of these data, we could, not using TL time lapse or not using PGS, if we can just look at our embryos in a conventional way at these timelines. So for example, if we look at our embryos at 96 hours post ICSI, and we see that it has already started becoming a blastocyst, then probably we can infer from this and just look at our embryos and say, probably it's got more chance of being an euploid than an embryo which has not started blastulation at 96 hours post ICSI. I mean, these are the small points which we can take from these data and use it in our conventional morphological assessment of our embryos.
Yeah, I think because there is no data indicating that we all should go for time lapse. So
yeah,
till
that's
then,
right.
we have to work on whatever experience we have with morphology.
Yes.
So we will take, there are many questions, but I'm just trying to take those which are related to the publication or to time lapse or PGS.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question, will a very short time to blastulation be predictive of aneuploidy?
Very short time, meaning I guess it takes its own time. We don't see blasters on day 3. So I guess if it is that fast, then it's going to be
obviously
probably aneuploid. But I guess if it is around the range, a mean of 96 hours on start and 122 hours on or 118 hours to the expanded blasters, it's within, I mean, 2 hours here way that way is an acceptable data, I guess.
True. I mean, there is something which will go by our own logic, and we don't even need data. If it's like day 3 blastocyst, we are not going to be happy with it.
But one thing in the study I saw that was the initiation. Let me just go through that particular slide. In this, to the start of initiation was 96 hours, whereas the mean was 100. When it was 98, it was fine, more chance of an euploid. But when it is 100, more chance of being an euploid. So just a matter of 2 hours, which we take as, it's only 2 hours in a conventional morphological assessment, seems to matter when it comes to division kinetics. So I guess we just need more data to reiterate the same, so that we take it as, okay, 98 hours, I must see the start of a blastulation. The 2 hours seems to matter here, no?
Yes, they do matter. That's true. So maybe we can take one concluding question, which is like, so there is much more than aneuploidy or ploidy defining the fate and viability of embryos?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think euploidy is not the end of everything. It is the beginning of another big race, I guess, because not all euploid embryos also implant. So the implantation for an embryo to be able to become a blastocyst and to be euploid and also to implant, I guess it's all totally different ball games of its own, because not all euploid embryos don't seem to implant. So I guess there is lots more to implantation than just euploidy.
Okay. There is one more question. Do you still recommend time lapse and PGS, PGTA as an adjuvant treatment when there is not enough evidence in its favor? I don't think you recommend it.
I don't think there is still evidence to, like, you know, we are still in the process of accumulating evidence to see if these definitely time lapse, whether it does help in predicting the embryo developmental capacity or its ploidy. We're definitely looking at it. There is no concrete evidence as of now to say that time lapse would be the norm or it should be incorporated into our regular clinical practice. In terms of PGTA, I guess is valid or it is indicated only in select few subset of patients. It would be rather not indicated to do that in all patients, of course. I guess none of these are routine practices, and definitely time lapse this is not probably the time to incorporate that into a regular clinical practice.
True. I mean, these are still, we are considering them still whether to have them as add-ons or not. So that's,
yes, at least in PGS, yes, it can help in certain subset of people, but time-lapse, we are still accumulating evidence to know how best to use that technology, which can give us so much amount of information.
I think it's more a very good educative tool as a cell biologist for us to really understand what's happening. And to my mind, I think that the embryo has this capability of correcting itself. So there are times when we see that an embryo actually starts dividing and you think it's going to become 2 cells and it opens out again. So possibly there is something that's not happened correctly and it goes on to rectify it. Because we do have a lot of repair mechanisms in the entire system. So to believe that there wouldn't be any repair mechanisms in these early stages of development, maybe quite naive. So maybe the embryo is correcting, and that's why you see certain where there is a little delay, but they seem to be normal after that. So the early kinetics.
And we do see these poor, extremely poor quality embryos, which we would have thrown away, but we implant because that's the only thing remaining. Go ahead and give us pregnancies. And it is not one stop thing that we are looking at. It's a continuous process. So we are yet to elucidate that continuous process.
True. So I will just take one last question, although it is not directly related to your talk. But since they say that there is trending day 7 blastocyst transfer, is it still best to transfer and freeze day 7 blastocyst in case patient fails to show any blastocyst on day 5 and day 6? So you are having a delayed blastocyst development day 7. What's your take on that?
We know that
so late, after all this presentation.
Day 7 blast, we know that the implantation rate is quite reduced, and hence whatever is becomes a blast on day 7, on day 5, day 6, and day 7, we store them separately, we freeze them separately. But then if that's the only thing remaining, I guess it is quite pertinent to freeze those blastocysts for the patient, because even though its implantation rate is 10 to 15%, 15% of the time, and I guess that 15% is better than having none for that patient. So we have to freeze it and keep it and give the benefit of doubt to the patient.
True. There are a lot of things we still don't understand, and I think at this stage, even if it has a remotest chance, we have nothing to lose. Except we are building up hopes for the patient for 15 days, but we are still not sure whether even with the least probability, the patient can still get pregnant. And
in 1 in 10, if they get pregnant, that 1 in 10
enough.
Gets the result.
So I think there are many questions. So do we have time, Shipra, to take 1 or 2 more?
Of course, ma'am, we can take the questions if Dr. Priya is okay with it.
Okay. Priya, are you okay with it? Okay,
yeah,
so we'll take some more questions. So as you know, there is self-correction of abnormal embryos and nature itself rejects. Do you still favor PGS in recurrent pregnancy loss patients?
I have had the honor of writing 2 different chapters for 2 different topics. One where PGS, I had to get evidence and write where PGS or PGTA as we know it now does not have any correlation or does not give any positive outcome more than waiting in cases of recurrent pregnancy loss. I wrote 1 chapter on that, and in another time I had to write another chapter where it helps patients with recurrent pregnancy loss. So I guess after going through the chapter which I wrote recently on how the time to pregnancy may be slightly longer when you wait for an appropriate pregnancy in recurrent pregnancy loss. This was in relation to where there have been chromosomal derangements in chromosomal translocation. But still, they do have a chance. The chance of them having a pregnancy through PGTA and through the waiting period, the regular waiting, was the same. So it is quite skeptical to say, yes, go ahead and do it. But it all depends on the aptitude of the patient whether they are willing to wait, because I think PGTA in terms of translocation gives the same result as waiting for 6 months and getting a pregnancy after that. So the asset, the data does not support it, but right now patients do request for PGTA when they have translocation and had a few pregnancy loss. It is one thing that we can definitely do offer, and it's quite a good indication for PGTA, but by data-wise scientific evidence, the result is the same.
True. So just a question, do you suggest to go for PGS in this COVID times?
Oh, right now we are even rethinking on restarting IVF clinics, and going for PGTA is, I think, far-fetched as of now.
Maybe they mean once things start, we'll go step by step.
Yeah, I guess one thing start, see, the point is now for me, even to get an amniocentesis done for my patients, it's quite difficult. So I guess the transport of our specimens from the lab to the molecular genetics and everything also matters now, the logistics. And I think once we start, when we don't know the vertical transmission or teratogenicity of the novel coronavirus, everything is on us and the patient to decide whether how much we want to go ahead with the ART cycles. Now a few centers have started doing only FETs. They're not even doing pickups. So I think we have to be quite cautious, but I don't think once we are doing pickup and transfer, doing PGS, PGTA, I think in 2-3 months, everything will start if things go well.
Actually, it's too early because we don't really know what trajectory this thing will take. And, so I guess it's a little too early for us to really decide what we would be doing.
We can do, when we can do.
We are literally living by the day, planning out ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. So just a last one. Do you offer karyotype to the parents before PGTA and all with male factor?
Any PGTA goes through a karyotype, and that's they have a basic thing to be done. So there's no way that we can miss that.
Okay. So I think we will end now. We are reaching 5. And I would like to thank you, Priya, for a very lucid presentation and it also answering a lot of questions. And I would like to thank the audience for the good interaction, because that shows that the presentation has really been of great interest to the audience. And I would like to end with a comment from Dr. Priya. I presume it's Dr. Priya Selvaraj. It's a comment on the study that the study would be better if they had actually compared morphokinetics with pregnancy rate versus only PGTA cycles.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly one I wish they had done. So I went ahead and when I studied it before, I went ahead and made wrote an email to Nina and also put a comment on the discussion on the paper. They have not got back, but however, I guess someday, they said on the previous discussions, comments that were given, they said they're going to relook on the data. I'm sure we will have more data coming on that. They can rework on the data and give it to us as well. That's a very valid point, which I was also thinking about.
Like when first Campbell study came in, way back in time, and that got us all very excited that, if we were able to actually predict, then life would be much better. So that would actually be better. But I guess more data comes in, and maybe the people are using this time of lockdown across the world to relook their old data and maybe hope they come up with something right at the end of it. So thank you very much, Priya, once again, and thank you, audience, for an excellent interaction. And thank you, Shipra and team, for organizing this. And we look forward to the next Journal Club meeting.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rajvi. Thank you, Dr. Priya. I'll also thank you especially for a fantastic analysis of the Journal Club article that you've done and, of course, answering the questions. So for everyone, the next Journal Club is on 29th May. And the topic for the next Journal Club is Day 5 versus Day 6 blastocyst transfers, a systemic review and meta-analysis of clinical outcomes. This is from Human Reproduction, October 2019 issue, and will be presented by Dr. Varsha Roy. So we'll send you the invites and we hope to see you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.